So Michael is from the University of Manitoba, but you're going to be transferring over to the Ornithology Lab at Cornell in the coming weeks, months, one of the two. And I think what's really interesting is that we asked Michael to come and talk today because he's done some research in terms of looking at decreased human activity during COVID-19 and how that impacted North American birds' response to that and lessons learned from lockdown. I'm sure many of us had read all those news articles in terms of wildlife coming in more into urban areas with reduced human activity. So we thought this would be really great to bring Michael here today to speak on that. So I'll turn it over to you, Michael, to get us started.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you fine.
Coming in. Okay, great. So yeah, thanks so much for having me and for the introduction. So my name is Michael. I was until recently a postdoc at the University of Manitoba Natural Resources Institute, working with Dr. Nikki Koper. As you mentioned, I am shortly going to be starting some work. My PhD work was in the Antarctic, and actually I'll be returning there with a project that is going to involve a partnership with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So I'll be making that transition soon, hopefully, assuming all the paperwork works out. What I'd like to talk to you today about is some of the work that we did during the pandemic. Actually, we came up with this idea to study what birds were doing sort of as human activity started to change really dramatically. So I'll be talking about that today. So yeah, please feel free to post any questions you have in the chat, and I'd be happy to chat away probably longer than you want me to stay here at the end of the talk. Let me make sure I'm on the right screen here. So before I really get into it, I wanted to acknowledge a bunch of folks. In addition to Dr. Koper, there's all these folks here on the left are all co-authors on the paper that we published, and I'll put a link to that paper if anyone wants to read more sort of at the end of the talk. And then a lot of the work that we did, Nikki put together this COVID-19 wild research group that is kind of a bunch of like-minded scientists all interested in working together to answer questions about how the pandemic influenced wildlife. And so you can read more about that on their website. And a couple of folks, Olivia Sanderfoot and that's a Dr. Olivia Sanderfoot now, and Dr. Amanda Bates, they were also instrumental in helping me think about sort of a lot of the basics of the project that we did. And then there's a number of other folks in that research group that are that have been really great to work with. Yeah. So if you can sort of think back to the beginning of the pandemic, which that's funny. I have in my notes here a year ago. It was much more than a year ago now, and it feels like a million years ago, I think, to most of us. But if you think back, we didn't really have a lot of knowledge about what activities were more or less risky, and so there was that initial period, that initial lockdown, when things really shut down, and not just in one place, but all over the world. And so scenes like this is from the UK, obviously, were pretty common. It's the middle of a city, middle of the day, and there was almost no traffic whatsoever. So this is a very, very stark difference to what occurred sort of even after that, sort of throughout the rest of the pandemic. When things were shut down, certainly we had COVID-19 restrictions in place, but activity sort of started to come back, at least sort of traffic on the roads started to come back to somewhat closer to normal. And then obviously was very different from anything that we had seen before. And as has already been mentioned, there was a lot of talk about wildlife and people noticing interesting wildlife observations during that period. And it was a little bit unclear whether or not this was the result of just people having more ability to notice these things. Maybe some of this stuff had been going on all along and people just hadn't had the chance to notice it or to really pay attention, or maybe there was actually something to this. And it was made a little bit more complicated by some of these stories that were debunked, that this particular one about dolphins in the Venetian canals turned out to be video from somewhere else in Europe, and it was mislabeled. So so there was a little bit of confusion about what was real, what was not, and if there was an effect of the pandemic, how broad scale was that? How universal was that? How many different species did it affect, and how strong was it? And so that was some of the motivation that we had in wanting to study this while we were cooped up in lockdown as well. So we spent about a year working on that, and what we started to think about. So humans have really dramatically altered the landscape. That's London right there, and London in the UK, that is, not London near you, so we can look at this landscape and think that landscape obviously has impacts. And when you do something like that to a landscape over hundreds of years, that's obviously going to impact the wildlife that exists on that landscape. But there are lots of factors that go into that. It's not just the physical structures that are there, but it's also the activity that goes along with it. When you build a road, you don't generally just build the road and then leave the road there without getting used. There's traffic on that road, and there's noise, and there's pollution, and there's activity coming from that road. For us, in a Western science perspective, we like to separate different factors. We like to isolate one factor so that we can test the effect of that while the others are held constant. But with modern human development, that's been impossible on really large scales because all those things go along together. Well, the pandemic allowed us to change that, or it gave us a window into what happens when you can control some of those elements. The folks that wrote this paper referred to that as referred to this period as the anthropause. It was a period when the activity, those normal human activities, were paused or at least reduced, but without changing other things. The buildings were still there, the roads were still there. All we had done was quiet ourselves down, slow ourselves down. And because this happened simultaneously across the whole planet, it was an experiment, if you want to think about it that way, that was much broader, much more expansive than we ever could have sort of envisioned and would ever want to do sort of on purpose on our own. So this really gave us an opportunity to help tease apart some of those differences. And so basically what we were interested in is, did birds use areas with lower human activity differently during the pandemic, during those initial lockdowns anyway, of March through May of 2020? And of course, you can't just, the challenge in that is that you can't just talk about, well, what were things like in 2020? You need to compare that to something. So in our case, we decided to compare that to the 3 prior years, 2017 through 2019. And the challenge there is that if you want to compare 2020 to something else, you need baseline data. You need to have already collected those data. And presumably what we sort of expected was that prior to the pandemic, with all the activity going on around an urban space, that birds might be relegated to some of the more lower developed or undeveloped areas, some of the more wild spaces, and there'd be fewer birds potentially because they're not using those spaces because of human activity. And those anecdotal observations suggested that when you reduce that activity, those birds, maybe they're still in the forests, maybe they start to move into the cities, and if they do, maybe they aren't as packed into those sort of urban forested islands as much as they maybe once were. And so this is the hypothesis that we wanted to test. We wanted to know if that was a real effect, but we needed that baseline data. We needed to have some way of comparing 2020 to the prior years. And so the way we did that was using Ebird Data. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Ebird Data. I probably don't have to go into it too much, but suffice it to say, it's a community science program that birders use to submit their observations. these checklists. Here's just a map of Winnipeg. I'm coming to you from Winnipeg tonight, and this is just a map of sightings of yellow warblers for a particular time period. Actually, that's the March through May. I believe this was probably of 2020 when I got this screen grab here. So these are yellow warblers occurring sort of in and around the Winnipeg area. We decided to focus our analysis on cities, and that'll become clear a little bit in a second. We focused on fairly large cities, greater than 50,000 residents, and those cities that had airports within the municipal boundaries. And the reason for that will become clear in a second. And we wound up finding 93 counties, or census divisions, if you want to talk about it in Canadian terms, across the US and Canada. And that's what we sort of focused our study on. So we're not looking at very rural, very out-of-the-way places. We're looking at places with cities. That was also helpful because that's where a lot of the Ebird data are concentrated, especially during the pandemic, when a lot of people weren't able to take those trips to rural Ontario. So that really helped. And we chose to do it. We chose to really focus on common species for this first analysis. So we had data on 82 relatively common species, like the yellow warbler here. Now, for those of you that use Ebird, you may have had the same question that I had initially, which was, wait a minute, we're talking about the pandemic here. My birding habits changed a lot in 2020. Could that have affected the results? And it certainly could have affected the results. And not only that, it gets worse. The bird migration varies a lot among years. And so even if our birding had stayed the same, even if the places where we had birded, for example, had stayed the same during 2020, how do we know that a change in 2020 was due to the pandemic rather than just some other anomaly? There were lots of things that were different in 2020 than 2019 or 2018. So how do we account for that? And how do we account for that presumable change in birding effort? And so there were several ways that we did that. The first way was to filter out Ebird data that were coming from what we called new users. Those were users that hadn't reported data from the same county in 2017 through 2019, but did in 2020. Initially, we suspected that actually there might be a large growth in the use of Ebird from people who had never used it before, but were stuck at home with nothing else to do and wanted to try this thing and try bird watching. We knew that new Ebird users sometimes have different levels of detection for certain birds, and we didn't want to try and address that with other methods. We wanted to keep it simple. And so what we did was just simply filtered out data from new users and just focused on people that had already been using Ebird in prior years. Turns out actually that Ebird growth didn't grow that much more than you would have expected based on the growth curve from prior years. So there were more people using it in 2020, but not too many more than you would have expected. So that I don't know if this particular filter really helped that much, but it certainly didn't hurt anything. But we do know that birders did wind up going to different places. They wound up changing geographically where they were birding. And so the other thing that we did was we subsampled the checklists that we were using so that the pre-pandemic and the pandemic data were distributed equally. And we did that like this. These are two maps of a particular county. This is actually in the state of Michigan. And the city of Lansing, Michigan is here in the northwest corner of this county. And so you can see a couple of things on this map. First of all, you can see that Ebird data are not uniformly distributed. We know this already. We know that Ebird data are very concentrated around urban areas. And you can sort of see some subtle differences. Now, it's obvious that this is 3 years of data. This is 1 year of data, so it makes sense that there's more observations in these 3 years together than there are in 2020. But there's also some patterns in the distribution. It's subtle sometimes, so you can still see that the major pattern is there. Most of the checklists are concentrated in this one grid cell right here. But if you look around that, you can see that this grid cell here and this grid cell here, this one has quite a bit more data than this one relatively. But if we move over here, now it's this cell that has more data than this cell. And that could have been for any number of reasons. It could have been maybe that that this cell up here had a little bit more kind of suburban area with people's yards. And as people were at home birding in their yards, there were more observations coming in from this area than there were here. And maybe that area has some other place that used to be visited pretty commonly by birders. Maybe it's a park, maybe it's a wetland or something like that. And so there's a difference, and in some cases it's subtle. The major pattern is still here. You still have more data around the city than you do in the more rural parts of the county, but we wanted to account for that. So what we did was we randomly sampled an equal number of pre and during pandemic checklists from each one of these cells. And we did this in such a way that we sampled as many cells as possible. Now this does two things. The most important thing is that this map here, which actually represents sort of both the pre-pandemic and the pandemic data, but each one of these cells has the exact same number of pre-pandemic and during pandemic checklists. So if there's 30 in this cell, that means there's 15 from before and 15 from after, or from during. And what that allows us to do is make a very direct comparison. So now the data from both periods that we're comparing are coming from more or less the same place geographically. The other thing that it does is it spreads the data sampling out a little bit more evenly. There's still some parts of the county that we just don't have data for, but we have much more data from sort of other more rural parts of the county and not only from the city center. And that helped us get a wider swath of data from different, more diverse habitats. And then the final thing that we did, and probably the most important, is that we didn't just look at whether or not there were more or fewer birds. We focused our analysis on a change in relationships. So did birds use areas, we measured how the birds used areas relative to different indices of human activity, and we looked at whether or not those relationships changed. I'll explain more about how we did that in a second. So these are the different indices of human activity that we used. We know that the pandemic affected human activity in lots of different ways, and unfortunately there weren't very many comprehensive ways to quantify that across the whole continent. But we were able to do these. So we had one sort of quasi-direct measurement of activity change during 2020. And that was down here in the lower left. That's this publicly available data set from Google that has county-specific data on whether people spent more time at home or at other places. They had a few different categories here. We focused on time spent at home, sort of as an index. And that helped us a little bit, but it was kind of coarse. That was only measured at the county level. At least those were the data that Google puts out publicly. And so we knew generally, this county over here had what we could call a stronger lockdown or a lower, sort of more of a decrease in human activity than a different county. But we couldn't necessarily say anything more specific than that. But we did want to do that. We did want to look at something at a slightly more specific way, just because we knew that birds are probably interacting with human activity at a much finer scale than just at the county. So these three variables up here that we looked at were all ways of measuring places where the pandemic was expected to have a greater or lesser effect. So for example, we looked at very roughly whether or not a checklist was located in a place that's more rural or more urban. By rural, I mean just somewhere that's not developed. So it could be a city park, or it could be sort of agricultural land or actual wild spaces. But is that checklist, is where that checklist occurred surrounded by more developed spaces or less developed spaces? And then we looked at the distance to two other things. One would be major roads. How far is that checklist from a major road, like a large highway? And how far is that checklist from an international airport? That's why we focused on counties with airports. And then the final thing that we looked at was this migration overlap. Basically, was the species sort of peak? Most of these birds, this was March through May, so in most of the United States, this is when species are moving through on migration. And we wanted to know, we knew that some of those species might pass through an area either before that peak in lockdown or after the peak in lockdown. So we wanted to know whether or not those species were moving through at the time when the lockdown was the strongest. And I'll show some figures about that in a few minutes. But so basically, each of these indices, in its own way, allowed us to measure places where the pandemic would have had a greater effect or it would have had a lesser effect. In each of these cases, either in urban places or close to roads or close to airports, in places with high overlap, or in places where that activity change was more pronounced, all of those were places where the pandemic would have had a greater effect. And we wanted to look at the relationships and how they changed. So you can think about that this way. If you imagine pre-pandemic, you can visualize sort of a species arrives in an area that has some developed areas near it. And so you can imagine that species, if that's a species that normally avoids human activity, a few of those individuals might wind up being close to an airport or near major roads or in those cities, but most of them are probably going to wind up in relatively rural places. If we want to try and quantify that, or kind of look at that relationship in a more mathematical way, it might look like this. As you get closer to an airport, the relative abundance of that bird that you detect is going to go down. I like to think about this sort of in relation to the degree of pandemic-related change that it would occur, or that it would have encountered during 2020. So close to an airport, there would have been a high amount of change as a result of the pandemic. Further from the airport, there wouldn't be as much change. There wouldn't be much difference between the pre-pandemic and the pandemic period when you're not close to that source of human activity that had an opportunity to change during the pandemic. So then in 2020, if this bird was no longer being sort of ushered away from somewhere like an airport, you might expect that the relative abundance of birds near that airport went up, for example. And maybe it actually went down. These birds were going through their migratory period. This was March through May, so they wouldn't have bred yet during the year. So we're not really looking at a change in abundance, an actual change in the total population size of the birds. What we're really talking about are birds choosing to spend their time in different places and showing up in places differently. Again, it's migration for most of these. So what we're really talking about here are probably migratory stopovers for the most part. A bird arrives in a place and it's going to decide where it hangs out within that relative area. And it's also going to decide how long it's there. And both of those things could affect how likely it is to get counted by a birder. And so if the bird no longer is avoiding these areas with high human activity, you might expect that relationship disappears, that now it doesn't really matter how far away from the airport you are, you might have the same relative abundance. So this is just one example. And it doesn't really matter what the absolute abundance of that bird's is. So, 2020 could have had really high abundance or it could have had really low abundance overall. What matters is the shape of this relationship. What is the slope of this line from a more mathematical perspective? So that's really what our analysis was designed to look for. This is what some of our results looked like for a particular species for a particular one of those indices. So this is the ruby-throated hummingbird. And as you can see, prior to the pandemic in orange here, it did not really have much of a relationship at all to the distance to an airport. And over here, this is where you're close to an airport, where you expect a large change during the pandemic. And here you're much further away from airports. And you can see that there's really no relationship there. So you're no more likely to see a bird relative to how close you are to an airport. In 2020, however, there is a remarkable change in that relationship. Now, when you're further from an airport, you're much less likely to see hummingbirds than when you're close to an airport. And that was actually, for this particular species, kind of surprising. I never would have expected that ruby-throated hummingbirds would be avoiding areas with airports. But it turns out that those areas near airports are pretty good habitat for them. At least they're pretty attractive habitat for them when we shut down all the activity associated with those airports. So we did this for a number of birds. Basically, what we interpret from this is that hummingbirds increase their use of areas near airports. And when we do this for all of those 82 species, we actually found way more sort of results than we expected to. I kind of figured that we might see a few species that responded maybe somewhat subtly, but most of the species that we looked at showed some change in relationship to at least one of those 5 indices of human activity. And about 3 times as many species showed an increased use of areas where that human activity was reduced the most, as opposed to a decreased use of those activities. So birds really did flock towards places where we reduced our activity. On top of that, we didn't really see large patterns in which kinds of birds saw responses and which didn't. There was a large diversity of birds, and they showed a huge variety in responses. So I'll just go through a few kind of fun examples here. Canada goose, everyone's favorite large waterfowl, increased their use of areas near roads. When we reduced that activity during 2020, just like American robins also increased their use of areas near roads. Obviously, very, very different birds. Canada geese, American robins, they're using habitat in very different ways. They require very different things, but both of them are apparently normally avoiding roads more so than they otherwise would once we quiet them down. I already mentioned airports a little bit. Here's another bird, very, very different kind of bird, Doublecrested Cormorant. They increased their use of areas near airports. Now, obviously, most cormorants probably aren't using the areas at the airport themselves. This is not necessarily close to an airport. If you remember that graph, we were looking at things up to tens to hundreds of kilometers away from an airport. So even within 10 kilometers of an airport, there still might be effects of that airport. We see that in the numbers that we get for species like Doublecrested Cormorant. We also had species that had the opposite effect. We didn't just see increases, although those were most prominent, but sometimes we saw decreased numbers of birds near places where we saw that reduction in human activity. Red-tailed hawk was one of those examples. We saw a decrease in the red-tailed hawk counts in places that are closer to major roads. And we could come up with all sorts of interesting hypotheses for why that is. It might have something to do with this bird, for example, which is perched over a road on a streetlight. It's possible that those red-tailed hawks were using that road for some reason, and when you decrease the traffic on that road, it becomes less attractive to them. Lots of really interesting results for lots of different species. I spoke a little bit about migratory overlap. It was really an important part of the bird's biology during this season, during that March through May period. And many of these birds that we're looking at, even if they are residents in that particular county, many of those individuals might not be. A lot of those American robins, for example, although American robins might breed in that county, a lot of the individuals passing through there might be moving further north. And so how might this affect their response, especially when a lot of birds weren't necessarily migrating through at the time when we saw those peak lockdowns? So we calculated, I mentioned that overlap index that we calculated. We did that this way. So we had the data from Google that were relative to the county, and we were able to see what the shape of that looked like. So most counties looked something like this. There was some variation among counties in terms of what the extent was and what the timing was exactly, but for the most part, it looked pretty much like this, that once we started in early March, that was before anything had really started to shut down. Late March, we start to see the increase in lockdowns and therefore a decrease in human activity. There was a period of peak lockdown sort of in the middle of April mostly. And then by late April, sort of early May, things had started to return back to normal. And almost none of the counties totally returned back to normal. Some of them came close, though. I think, regardless of what the rules were, there were a lot of places that started to increase the human activity. The traffic went back to normal and such relatively soon after that initial peak lockdown. But there was this peak period right here. And what we did was we looked at the bird abundance in that county for that species during that same period. And we calculated, so, okay, what is that peak migratory period? And how much does that peak migratory period overlap with the peak lockdown period? And that's what we used to come up with our level of migratory overlap. The thinking being that when this overlap is high, then the major pulse of those birds, most of the birds that would be occurring in that county, were arriving there when they were experiencing that large reduction in activity. And if the peak happened either well after or well before, then they're not experiencing as much of a peak. And so this is what if we just look at that variable for a couple of different species spread across the counties we use to model, we can see sort of what that looks like. For blue-winged teal, that's a species that was migrating through the middle of the continent right around the time, those sort of mid-latitudes, right around that peak lockdown period in sort of early to mid-April. And then another species, the ruby-throated hummingbird, migrates much later. And so during that peak April period, it was mostly moving through the Gulf Coast and wasn't really reaching up further north in its range until much later. And we saw lots of species that responded to that overlap variable. Blue-winged teal, for example, that species I just showed, the counts of blue-winged teal were much greater in areas with greater overlap between the lockdowns and when that pulse was moving through that particular county. So we saw a lot of responses for a lot of different species, many more than I thought we would. But there were some birds that we did not see any signs of the pandemic affecting them at all. And it's notable, it was a little bit hard to draw conclusions from birds that didn't show a response, but it's notable how many of those introduced and common, what we normally think of as city birds, were not on that, or were on that list of birds that didn't show any effect. These three, for example, house sparrows, rock pigeons, and house wrens, we didn't see any effect of the pandemic at all, either increases or decreases. So that was sort of an intriguing response, something that we started to think a little bit more about. Why is it that we might not see responses from some of these more urban adapted birds? There are probably some good reasons for that. So ultimately, what did we learn? Well, I think that the most important takeaway is that human activity is important, and that it's not just the presence of things like roads or airports. It's the fact that we're using those spaces. We're creating noise, we're creating activity, we're creating pollution, and all that activity also impacts how wildlife see those spaces and use those spaces. And even if you leave the road and leave the airport, when you reduce the human activity, birds respond. The next important point, I think, is that birds respond quickly. These pandemic, we're talking about the very initial stages of lockdowns here, and sometimes these birds were migrating through. They left the neotropics in February or March, and they arrived in these places that in prior years had been very active. Many of these birds would have been first-year birds. They never would have migrated north before. But as they moved into North America, they encountered these habitats and they started using them differently. And so it didn't really take long at all, just a matter of days or weeks sometimes, for birds to start reacting to our change in activity. And that really says something really profound, that birds can adapt, at least to some extent, many species can, very quickly to our activity when we quiet ourselves down. But we also saw that we can't generalize necessarily across all birds. We did find a lot of birds that increased in places with larger reductions in activity, but not all of them. And we saw a good number of species that either had mixed responses or that showed decreases in counts near areas of lower activity. And so, we can't necessarily generalize. And this is important, I think, from a management perspective. If you're trying to focus on conserving species, it's important to think about how that species interacts and whether it actually responds to activity or whether it's responding to something a little bit more traditional, something like the actual habitat that it needs. It's important to note here that we focused on species that are fairly common. We didn't really look at species that were uncommon, mostly because we didn't necessarily know if we had enough data to really show those. We're starting to look a little bit at that now, things like species at risk. But it's very possible that some of those more uncommon, more specialized species, things that are species at risk, might have reacted very differently and might not show the same types of responses. And so if we step back, I think it's worth emphasizing that most important result, that our activity affects birds. It's not just the habitat. So when you look at this map and you think about all the changes to habitat that have occurred in a place like this, that is part of it for sure, and that's a very important part, and always will be. But it's our behavior within that space that also affects how birds use those spaces. Now that brings up another important caveat, of course, and that is it's easy to see these results and think, oh, well, 2020 was great for birds. Well, maybe not. We know that birds were attracted to areas with people, but a lot of the threats that birds face were still present. There were still a lot of introduced predators. There was still a lot of pollution from industry and other things that didn't slow down. And there were still buildings with a lot of glass and a lot of risk of collision. So all the threats that that birds face, well, not all of them, many of the threats that birds face didn't really change much at all during 2020. And so if birds were attracted to places that potentially have more of these things present, it's possible that 2020 actually resulted in what's called an ecological trap, that birds were attracted to an area, they weren't being scared away from an area by our activity, and that could have actually resulted in a decline in something like survivability or reproductive potential. Unfortunately, a lot of those things that we use to measure those were not happening during the pandemic for obvious reasons. And so it's important as we go forward to not necessarily think that 2020 was better, just different, and has the potential to be better, but also had the potential to result in a trap like this. So it definitely requires a little bit more work. And the other thing that we can't necessarily say yet are about the mechanisms. So we can make some hypotheses about how it is that a bird experiencing pandemic lockdowns reacts and what exactly is it reacting to. But we didn't. Our study was not really set up to measure those mechanisms or to tease apart those mechanisms. So I think the one thing that comes to mind, that comes to most people's minds, is noise. Noise is one of the things that was most obviously different in urban spaces and spaces near roads and airports. And that permeates the environment. There's a lot of research going on more recently about the effects of noise pollution. And so noise is one of those things that has a high likelihood of being an important mechanism that was responsible for some of these patterns, but it's not the only one. It could have been the activity itself. It could have been just the movement of people, movement of cars. It also could have been the activity of predators or food resources. So I mentioned the red-tailed hawk. It's possible that it relies on food resources that were not as common during the pandemic. There are other predators. There are predators of many bird species that may have reacted differently. Maybe those domestic cats that are roaming around human habitats, maybe they reacted differently to the pandemic as well, and that could have led to bird behavior changing in counterintuitive ways. So there's lots of possible mechanisms that could explain all these different responses, and they may differ for different species. And we really need future work to be able to tease those apart, and hopefully other data sources out there that can help us with that. So I think that the bottom line, the main takeaway, is that we can make urban spaces at least more attractive to birds. And again, there's lots of other research into how to make them better for birds. And so we can do those things, but we need to consider our activity to make it work. You can't just build a place and not address the fact that there's going to be humans living and working and using that space. And so if we're thinking about this example in Asia about creating a green city or an eco-friendly city, if we want that city to be wildlife friendly, we have to think about things like the noise or the activity or the other things. Once we can tease apart some of those mechanisms, we need to learn more about how our activity in a place like this affects wildlife in order to really make it wildlife friendly. There's other important points, I think, to take away from this, and one of them, one of the most important, I think, is the value and limits of community science data or citizen science data. A program like Ebird was instrumental. There's no possible way we could have done this without having those data from Ebird, because scientists just frankly weren't able to cover that much territory and weren't able to move around as much during the pandemic. But even if we were, there's just not enough scientists to be able to do something at this sort of scale. This is the sort of scale that you really need publicly sourced community science data to do. There are limits, of course, to community science data, and there were certain things that we had to do and ways that we had to restrict our analysis to account for those. And there's considerations, things that like how has the effort among those members of the public changed? So there are limits and considerations you have to take into account, but the value of those data are immense, and we're hugely grateful to all of you, for example, for going out and collecting Ebird data during the pandemic. I think it's also important to note that you shouldn't jump to conclusions. So we started seeing some of those anecdotal observations. We really needed to kind of dig into those to learn about them more and understand how those are really affecting, whether or not those anecdotal observations are really telling the truth or not. But those anecdotal observations can be really useful in forming hypotheses. We wouldn't necessarily have thought to do this had people not been posting on social media and noticing the things around them. We have to be aware of the environment around us, and that's something that I'm sure your organization has been teaching people for a while. The other thing that's important to think about is that the pandemic was global. So this is a very North American focused study, but other people have been doing work around the world and finding some similar things, but also some different things. And so that's really useful to think about, that this was a global unplanned experiment, if you want to call it that way. And so we can really learn a lot by comparing what happened around the world. So if you'd like to learn more, the paper is publicly available. It's an open access paper, so you're more than welcome to do that. And if you'd like, I can post that link so you can click on it in the chat. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about it and answer more questions. And there's a ton of data in the paper, but if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to chat more. And yeah, if you do want to contact me, here's some contact information for myself and for Dr. Koper. And then that website again for the working group. And there's lots of cool links to other cool scientists doing interesting work there. So I'll leave that up for a second and let people start typing in their questions into the chat. But thank you very much for the opportunity. And yeah, it was really great to chat.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's very interesting work on that side. I guess one of the questions that I have while I wait for other people to type in the chat here is, like, did you see geographic differences? Because you did this across different areas in North America. So did you see geographic differences for particular areas in terms of the response of birds, like outside of looking at it from the distance from roads or airports?
Yeah, it's a good question. The way we did our analysis, Ebird data are really useful, but they can be messy from a statistical point of view. And so in order to really take things away from Ebird data, you have to look at a lot of them. And so our analysis, we did include a means of accounting for differences in the overall abundance of birds. Obviously, robins are going to be more common in one place versus another. So we accounted for that in the models, but we really needed all of those data to look at the changes in those relationships. So we didn't look at for regional differences in the extent to which those relationships changed. But it's certainly something that could have happened. One of the things we wanted to do was compare counties that had stronger lockdowns to counties that had weaker lockdowns. And so we needed to use sort of all the data to do that. So I guess you could say that there were differences if you compared among counties, and that one index that from the Google data that compared relative how different counties responded, that would certainly get at that question a little bit. But in terms of specifically, if I could say, like, yeah, the birds changed their behavior a lot in this region, but not this region, we're not able to do that with the models that we used for this paper, just because we needed to make it a little bit more universal in order to get that information out.
Yeah.
But
sure.
it's a great, there are lots of opportunities, and the purpose of this paper was just to do a very broad brush look at the topic. You could easily take a deep dive into the Ebird data or other data for a very specific region, just for the Guelph region maybe, and look at that on a region by region basis. It could certainly be done. It would just take the effort to do it.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, I'm just thinking too, in terms of just some of the differences of coming into like spring 2021. In Ontario, we were very much locked down until probably around mid-June. So, which I know wasn't the case for everywhere around, but I know it was the third lockdown was a long was a long lockdown for us in Ontario. So I think it spanned from April until mid-April until mid-June. So so there would be even possibilities there as well.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Yeah, it was interesting the degree the way that we calculated that degree of change in differently for different counties. It was sort of a very rough sort of way of calculating sort of across the whole period, just to make it simpler for the model. And the numbers, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers. I think that it ranged from about an 8% change in human activity up to I think it was like a 25, maybe 26% change, or maybe a little bit higher than that. It was not higher than 30%. So that's the sort of the level of difference that we're talking about, just using those Google data among sort of the counties that locked down the most on average over that 3-month period versus the counties that changed the least. That's sort of a North American perspective. Other people from other parts of the world may have experienced lockdowns very differently. In India, for example, they had lockdowns that were quite short, maybe only a few days, but very stringent. And there was a massive difference between normal activity and lockdown activity when there were no trucks, no cars, no one leaving their house. People were literally in their home, doing nothing else. Unlike a lot of places in North America where a lot of essential services were still continuing. So we still had a fair amount of activity, even though that activity was reduced. And so I think going forward, comparing how things changed in different parts of the world is going to be very useful, because here we're talking about maybe subtle differences between some counties versus another. But when you look at across the world, there were some really dramatic differences in how different countries approached lockdown.
Yeah. Yeah, so there was a question that came into the chat here. So thinking about the quality of eBird data, which is something that you had mentioned, are there any thoughts on how eBird users can input useful data? Like, is there a way that we can kind of change our approach to putting in data? Yeah, so that's that's the question there.
Definitely. And what you consider good Ebird data really depends on who you on what the kind of analysis is you're trying to do. Even something as simple as an incidental record of a bird, a presence record of a single bird that's not a complete checklist in one location, that can be useful for some things. That's what a lot of traditional ecological data are, just presence only data. There is quite a lot that has been written already about what the sort of the highest quality eBird data are like, and I definitely recommend. I'm also an eBird reviewer for other regions, for the oceanic regions. So, but the reviewers have talked a lot about what the best quality data are. So there are some good recommendations on the eBird website, on the help pages there, and if you'd like, I can dig up some of those links if people are interested. But there are some good recommendations on how to collect what are more useful eBird data. The basic rule of thought is complete checklists. So even if you get annoyed by them, count all those robins and Canada geese and all those other boring birds that we don't like to look at sometimes. Mostly because they can be cool too. I like looking at starlings sometimes; they're really pretty. Complete checklists are definitely useful, more so than not complete checklists. And then the more you can split checklists up into individual units and smaller amounts of time, the shorter you make them in terms of distance traveled, the shorter you make them within reason for duration. If you do multiple checklists over a given day, as opposed to fewer longer checklists that cover more area, that allows them to be much more specific, especially if they've got good specific locations using your smartphone, because that gets a lot more precise. And so that there were birds here at this time of day in this specific location. And that winds up getting more useful. I sort of mentioned in passing that we had a bunch of other filters that we used, things like distance traveled and duration. And so we cut off checklists that we were using for our particular project using some of those cutoffs. If they were longer than this duration or longer than this distance traveled, then we didn't use them. And that cutoff is going to be different for different research projects based on how they're using the data, what kind of habitats they're looking at. There's all sorts of considerations that go into that. But yeah, if people are interested, there's lots written out there that Cornell has put out on how to make your birding habits a little bit more useful from a scientific perspective.
Yeah, that's good. Well, we can try and put those links and resources. We can share them in different ways. So maybe that'll be something that's good. Or maybe we need to have somebody come and talk to us about like how to make our eBird checklists work for science as well. I think that's a good point though, in terms of like, that's why it's important to note that little checkbox that's always there that says like, is this a full checklist?
Yeah.
Or did you
And
ignore all of those
it's
Canada keys?
important. It's important to think about that. Yeah, if you really put the effort into watching all the birds, and this is something actually that people don't appreciate sometimes. As long as you are recording all the birds that you were able to detect and observe, then that's okay. Even if you don't necessarily, if you know that you're not necessarily the world's best birder, and there are birds that you're probably not being, not hearing or not being able to actually, detect, that's understood. We know that detection is not perfect, and every one of us that use Ebird data to do science, we work that into the model. That's part of the process. So you shouldn't be afraid to do that, to say yes for that question, if you're concerned that you're not necessarily detecting everything, because we know that you don't detect everything. As long as you're reporting what you do detect, then you're good to say yes, I'm reporting a complete checklist.
Yeah. So I guess a question that I had, I know you had talked a little bit about the mechanisms that might have been the reasons why birds were using more areas or not. And you had mentioned about noise pollution. So what are some ways that, like, are there ways that we can decrease noise pollution and that? And I know that's probably not something that we can answer today, but maybe some of
Yeah,
your thoughts on that side.
and I'm certainly no expert. There are many people more qualified than I am. I think, frankly, one of the simplest things is exactly what we're doing now. I think that one of the things that pandemic has taught us is there are lots of things that we can do remotely that we didn't used to do remotely. We have the technology now that we don't necessarily have to travel places to do some of the things that we want to do. And in some ways, that makes it easier. It allows me to give a talk to you from Winnipeg, and I probably would not have been able to travel to Ontario to give the talk tonight. So, it allows us to do things, but it also cuts down on the amount of traffic and movement, and that, more than anything else, I think is something that we can strive for. Maybe if you run a business, you can find ways that people can work from home 1 or 2 days a week. It still gives you the benefit of having people work in person. There's obviously a lot of benefit to that. I want to get back to that myself, but it doesn't have to be every day. Maybe there are other ways, technological ways, I think, that we can reduce noise. There's some ways that have been developed to try and reduce noise on roads. I think that there's a lot to be done there, and I'm certainly no expert on that. But I think any technological solution that we can come up with to cut down on noise pollution is probably going to help imitate some of those things that we saw in the pandemic. We obviously don't want to redo the lockdowns of the pandemic. That's just not sustainable. It's not something we can really look forward to. But we can try and pick out what it was that changed during the pandemic and try and work that into our daily lives where we can. So I think working from home and finding ways to reduce road noise are a good first step. But there's probably other ways, and there's probably some really innovative ways that we haven't thought of yet that hopefully people will. But it's something I think that we should start thinking about.
Yeah, that's great. So there's 2 more questions that are in the chat here. I'm going to come back to one because it's not quite related, and the other one is more related to what you spoke about. But there was a question about, you mentioned that you excluded new eBird users or new birders from the eBird data before use. In what way could this excluded data have skewed the results? And so,
yeah, we were at first initially concerned. This was around the early part of the project, sort of the summer of 2020, and there was a lot of talk about whether or not there were a lot of new birders being starting their eBird, starting to use eBird, because a lot of people were had never birded before, and suddenly they're stuck at home, and oh, look, there's these birds, these are kind of fun to watch. We didn't know if eBird use was going to involve a lot of new users, all sort of during that initial pandemic period. There's prior research that shows that when birders first start using eBird specifically, but also especially when they're new birders, they've got a very different level of detection than more experienced birders. which isn't a bad thing. It just means that if you have if 2020 had, if the data that we were using for 2020 had a much higher proportion of new birders than old birders or experienced birders, that would potentially skew the detection, which means that we might see, for example, fewer birds when there weren't actually fewer birds. It was just that the number of birds detected went down because the pool of people that we were using had changed in their relative ability to detect, or the relative amount at which they were reporting birds. So that was one issue. And there's other things about brand new eBird users. And the current research shows that after someone's been an eBird user for a year or so, I mean, it's fuzzy. There are no like hard and fast rules here. But we were leery enough about a possible influx of brand new birders using eBird during 2020 that we decided it was safer to just not use those data. Now that actually some other papers have been published, there was a paper published sort of in late summer of 2020 by the Cornell folks that actually looked at eBird use, and then another paper by someone who compared a bunch of different community science or citizen science programs. Didn't actually look like eBird use changed all that much more than it would have otherwise. So I suspect if we went back and redid the analysis and didn't take out any new data and did the same subsampling procedure we did the way we did for geography, I suspect that our results wouldn't actually have changed that much. That was probably something that we did initially in the process that was a little bit on the conservative side, and we probably would see the same results if we had left those other data in there.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting from that standpoint. And person says, makes sense, thank you. So the other question here is actually related to what you're going to be researching in Antarctica.
Yeah, so my background is in seabird biology. I did my master's degree out on the West Coast in Washington State, and then my PhD was at Stony Brook University in New York, which involved trips down to the Antarctic Peninsula aboard cruise ships, actually, studying penguins and other seabirds there. And the new project I'm going to be starting is also going to involve some work with the cruise industry, looking at folks that are on that are also doing eBird related stuff. So we have a lot of data from the oceans, not a lot of data, but some data from oceans, from pelagic trips that are going out, far from shore, especially in the Antarctic as they're crossing the Drake Passage. And my next big question is, how can we use those eBird data? Can we do some of the same things that we do for land birds using eBird data with data coming from the oceans? And there's going to involve some data collection by both scientists and the public to try and look at how those data compare. So it's going to be a partnership between some of the cruise industry companies and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is really exciting, but still stuff that's being worked out in terms of the partnerships and everything. So hopefully, fingers crossed, everything will work out. And hopefully COVID doesn't interrupt things too much, and I will be back into the Antarctic come probably January or February.
Yeah, that's very cool. Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. So I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I think I might call it there, but I do have one last question for you. What's your favorite bird?
Ooh, oh man, so difficult. So I mean, I mentioned I was a seabird biologist. If you asked me if I separate things into seabirds and non-seabirds, seabirds, I would have to think about it. There's so much to think about. Non-seabirds, I definitely have a favorite passerine, which is the cedar waxwing. That is by far my favorite songbird, for a lot of reasons, but they're cool birds. And that's probably my favorite non-seabird. I mean, there's some cool waterfowl, and there's some cool certainly some cool raptors that I enjoy. Here in Winnipeg, actually, I'm lucky enough to live in an apartment complex where there's some peregrine falcons that come by fairly regularly. Not right now, it's a little bit late in the year for them now, but come spring again, the peregrines will be back, and they're fun to watch. But I think I'd go with cedar waxwing if we're excluding the seabird world.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, well, there's no wrong answer, so But yeah, I think that would be great. I think we'll stick on a little bit just so we can share some of these links into the chat
Yeah,
on that
I'm
side.
trying to find the link. Ebird keeps changing their help page, but somewhere I know that somewhere there is a post about how to make, like, what is the best quality. Yeah, I'll have to try and find it.
Yeah, it's okay if you can't find it right now. We can we can always share it afterwards as well too.
Yeah.
But I know that somebody did ask about the Arboretum bird ID courses, so I'm just going to throw that into the chat where you can find that. And so that's at the Arboretum Guelph, and that is hosted online. So it's a nice way to like spend a lunchtime off of work is looking at birds. So. And yeah, I think if there's no other questions, we can, people are welcome to leave, and we can go from there. Excellent, Michael. I can share them afterwards.
Okay, all right.
I'll send an email. I'll send an email to the people that read. Yeah, I'll send an email to the people that registered. How about that?
Cool. Very good.
Good. We got some smiley faces, and thank you so much for sharing your research with us. It's very interesting. So I think there's a lot more things we can learn for sure.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, and thank you to everyone who collected Ebird data. It was part of the program. It was part of our project, so it's in there somewhere.
That's great. It's always good to know where all of our efforts go off to.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, everyone have a good rest of your night, and thank you again, Michael, for your wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thanks. Good night, everyone.
Good night.